The part I'll start by reading was published first of all in Granta, and the book as a whole, actually, at one stage it was going to be published in the US as fiction and in the United Kingdom as non-fiction. And they ended up publishing it as non-fiction in both places, but I really liked the way that it looked like it was going to be both things, because the distinction between fiction and non-fiction actually means absolutely nothing to me. So that's a way of saying that, of course, all the events described in this piece are completely made up. This is called Hotel Oblivion. Although Dave was English and lived in Milan, we, Dazed and I, called him Amsterdam Dave, because that's where we met him, in Amsterdam. We were there for the 40th birthday of our friend Matt. Matt doesn't live in Amsterdam either, but his wife, Alexandra, had booked them into a suite at a boutique hotel called the 717. She'd also invited a dozen of Matt's friends to spend the weekend in Amsterdam. Now, obviously, Alexandra was not going to spring for everyone's accommodation. The idea was that on Friday, she and Matt would take us all out to dinner. And then on Saturday, is it better like that or like that?
Better when you're
Closer, like that?
Yes.
Okay. Then on Friday, she and Matt would take us all out to dinner, and on Saturday, they would receive us in their lavish suite for drinks, a kind of at-home, away from home. Matt's more successful friends booked themselves rooms at the 717, but Dazed and I checked into a cheap hotel, inconveniently located some way from the centre of town. As it happened, Amsterdam Dave was staying there as well, but much more important than this administrative coincidence was our shared sense of the obligations imposed on us by a weekend in Amsterdam. Nearly everyone in our party liked the idea of dinner, followed by a few joints in a bar, but only Amsterdam Dave was committed to making it a truly memorable weekend in the sense that he would remember nothing whatsoever about it. I was in the twilight, the long autumn of my psychedelic years, and this was to be my last hurrah, or one of them at any rate. I'd never met Amsterdam Dave before, but I took to him from the moment he explained the philosophical basis of the weekend. It's all about moderation, he said in the greenhouse on Friday night, after a deliciously inauthentic Thai meal. Everything in moderation, even moderation itself. From this it follows that you must from time to time have excess, and this is going to be one of those occasions. I couldn't agree more, I said, impressed by the rigour of his thinking. As I see it, we are here to do the damn. We want to have the Amsterdam experience. Indeed we do, said Amsterdam Dave. On Saturday morning, accordingly, we made our way to a place called the Magic Mushroom Gallery. Amsterdam Dave looked slightly the worse for wear. That is to say, he looked in better shape than he would for the rest of the weekend. I've seen him on several occasions since that weekend in Amsterdam, and I've never seen him look anything like as good as he did then. His face had some colour in it. That colour was grey, admittedly, but at least it was a colour. Dazed looked lovely too, unequivocally so. She was wearing a woolly hat that I'd bought her as an advance Christmas present, and this, combined with her wonky tortoiseshell glasses, gave her the appearance of an eccentric intellectual beauty. A nutty archaeologist, say, as played by a Hollywood actress who was in her 30s and trying not to rely solely on her looks, determined to show that she could do character. And me? Well, doubtless I looked a complete joke. From the outside, you'd have thought that I was the kind of person whose over-youthful wardrobe, skateboarding t-shirt, trainers, hooded sweatshirt, could not disguise the fact that he was 42, an intellectual with nothing but ink to his name. But for much of that weekend, I felt myself to be at the height of my powers, or thereabouts. I concede that we may have looked an oddly matched trio as we sat down in a cafe to consume our newly purchased mushrooms, but I was not expecting to get thrown out quite as soon as we did. Well, not thrown out exactly, but given a very stern talking to by the barman. He didn't want us doing mushrooms in here, he said. This took a moment to sink in. We were being ejected from a bar in Amsterdam for taking drugs. That's like getting chucked out of a pub for drinking beer, said Dazed. I've achieved very little in my life, and perhaps this is why I felt a faint glow of adolescent pride at our undesirable status. The barman had one of those old, fanatically grizzled, druggy faces, and his dull eyes did not regard us at all sympathetically. I couldn't take issue with him because my gullet was clogged with gag-inducing mushrooms, which I was trying to swill down with the remaining drops of water from Dazed's bottle of Evian. But evidently, the three of us collectively registered sufficient surprise to generate an explanation from the barman. "I don't want you puking," he said. "Several things," said Amsterdam Dave, who'd succeeded in swallowing his mushrooms. "First, at my age, I do not need lessons in how to behave. I'm a very civic-minded person. Second, my friends and I have a combined age of almost 115 years, and we have, I think it's fair to say, no intention of throwing up. Third, if we do feel like throwing up, we'll make sure we step either outside or into the toilet. Fourth, if we are going to throw up, it's not going to happen for at least half an hour. And in the meantime, perhaps you'd be so good as to bring us 3 coffees. It was an extremely impressive speech, and for a moment I thought the barman was going to oblige. Then, with no alteration of expression, he clicked his fingers, pointed to the door, and uttered 2 words. The first was "asshole," and the second was "out." "There is a world elsewhere," I said to him, with all the dignity I could muster, almost none, as we headed for the door. It didn't really matter getting booted out like this. We simply took our custom elsewhere and went somewhere else. That's basically all we did for the rest of the day. We kept going elsewhere. It was rainy outside, and each time we went outside, we started thinking about getting inside again. At first, this wasn't a problem, because it wasn't raining. Oh, it was raining all right, but compared with the way it rained later, this was nothing. This was clement. There was even a glimmer of sunshine. The leaves, the ones left in the trees, I mean, those on the ground in heaps were a different kettle of fish altogether, glowed in the brief intervals when the sun was shining. But even when the sun was not shining, it was relatively pleasant. Conditions deteriorated later on, but at this early stage of the day, our main concern was the nauseous canker of doubt put in our minds by the surly barman. We kept expecting to feel sick, and then when we no longer kept waiting to feel sick, we kept going somewhere else. First, though, we ordered 3 coffees in another almost identical bar where we waited to feel sick. When that didn't happen, we went somewhere else. The sky was silvery grey. There was cloud activity, movement, variant shades of grey, the possibility of things improving. The day had not settled into the unanimous grey pall that indicated things were not going to get better until several days after we left, possibly not until next spring, by which time we would be long gone, and anything that happened here would be long forgotten, except by the 1 or 2 people, probably only one, possibly only me, whose business it is to make sure that such things are not forgotten, even if that means they have to be reinvented from scratch. At some point, conditions began to deteriorate. The wind picked up. It began raining heavily, and then, once it had begun raining heavily, some kind of maritime gale kicked in. We wanted to get out of the wind-whipped rain, but in order to get out of the rain, it was necessary to continue walking in it, at least for a while. We headed for the relative tranquility of the Van Gogh Museum, where the paintings pitched and reeled in a blaze of yellow. Not that we saw anything of them. Conditions had deteriorated to the extent that everyone in Amsterdam had just one aim in mind: to get out of the rain, and into the Van Gogh Museum. Everyone was wet and steaming, and at any moment a soggy stampede seemed a distinct possibility. Occasionally, in the background, a sun burst over the writhing corn of Arles. A Roman candle night, starry, swirled into life. Blossom-tormented trees reared into view. Pigment-coloured faces beamed brightly, but mainly they were just the drenched backs of museum-goers in their foul weather gear, jostling for position. The thirsty yellow of Arles emphasized that here, in Amsterdam, it was the kind of autumn day that is all but indistinguishable from the dregs of winter. More and more visitors were pouring into the museum. The paintings were like the last lifeboats in the Titanic, and only a lucky few were going to get a glimpse of a gawking sunflower or Gauguin's empty chair, which, for all we knew, was not even there. Everyone else had to take their chances with the drawings or any other bit of art that floated their way. The mushrooms, mercifully, were not as strong as they might have been, and before long we were out in the rain again. Incredibly, conditions had deteriorated still further while we'd been in the museum. The weather, to cut a long meteorological story short, had gone from bad to worse to even worse. Is it the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness? Dazed asked as we battled through the rain. I suppose it is, technically, but I'm beginning to suspect that this is one of those places where they don't even have autumn. Each year they just plunge headlong from spring into the worst winter in living memory, I said. Is it the time of the falling fruit and the long journey to oblivion? Said Dazed. It really might be. Do you think this might be a nice cafe? It did indeed look like a nice cafe, but once we were inside, we became entangled in an impenetrable thicket of chairs. We couldn't move for chairs. With the Van Gogh experience still reasonably fresh in our minds, it seemed as if Gauguin's empty chair had cloned itself and taken up permanent residence in this cafe. Amsterdam Dave's analysis of our situation was less art historical, more pragmatic. Normally in cafes, it's difficult to get a chair, he said, but here there are too many chairs. He could not have put it more succinctly if he'd tried. There was an hilarious surfeit of empty chairs, so many in fact that there was no room to sit down. We kept moving them, but as soon as we had moved one chair, another was in the way. Eventually we managed to create a space in which we had only 3 or 4 chairs each, which was not a bad ratio for those who are weary and damp of limb. We stretched out, ordered refreshments from a punky waitress who was either oblivious to or unperturbed by the superabundance of seating. "Excuse me," said Amsterdam Dave when she returned with our drinks. "We were just wondering, does it seem to you that there are rather a lot of chairs here?" Although Amsterdam Dave had addressed this question to the waitress, it was of course intended entirely for our benefit and amusement, and find it amusing we did. Very much so, weepingly so. Ha ha, we couldn't stop laughing. The more we tried to stop laughing, the more we had to laugh. As far as we were concerned, it was just about the wittiest question in recorded history. A truly wonderful remark, right up there with anything ever said by anyone. Good old Amsterdam Dave. Having got us kicked out of one cafe, he was now in the process of getting us thrown out of a second. I struggled to get a grip on myself. I thought of the horrible conditions outside. I thought of us walking in the freezing horizontal rain. I avoided making eye contact with the others, concentrated on thanking the waitress and murmuring non-specific apologies on our behalf. Then, when the waitress had gone off, in something of a huff, we subsided into giggles, wiped the tears from our eyes, and succeeded in getting a grip on ourselves. In the wake of our giggling spasm, I recalled that in the morning I'd made an impulse purchase of a pair of trousers. Remembering this, I assumed that I'd lost them in the course of our journey through the storm-ravaged streets of Amsterdam, but miraculously they were here beside me in a bag. I decided there and then to change out of my wet trousers, which were soaking cold and wet, and into my new ones, which were dry and lovely and warm. In the cramped confines of the toilet, I had trouble getting out of my wet trousers, which clung to my legs like a drowning man. The new ones were quite complicated too, in that they had more legs than a spider. Either that, or they didn't have enough legs to get mine into. The numbers just failed to add up. Always there was one trouser leg too many, or one of my legs was left over. From the outside, it may have looked like a simple toilet, but once you were locked in here, the most basic rules of arithmetic no longer held true. 2 into 2 simply would not go. It was insane. It took a terrible toll on my head. I concentrated hard, applied myself with a vengeance to the task in hand. I got one leg in. I got the other in. Hooray! A man who has finally put behind him the spectre of 30 years of unwanted celibacy. I'm in! Cannot have felt a greater surge of triumph and self-vindication than I did at that point. Such exultation was short-lived, however, for these trousers were wet too. Somehow I'd put back on the wet pair that I'd just taken off. The dry ones were still dry, waiting to be put on. I was back where I started. After all the effort of the last, how long? I could have been in here for hours. This was a crushing blow, and one I was not sure I could recover from. How had it happened? Somehow, evidently, I had taken off my wet trousers and put them on again. Undeterred, or, more accurately, almost entirely deterred, I started again. I extracted my long limbs from the wet pair and carefully eased them into the dry pair. This time, after much effort, I succeeded putting them on back to front. By now I was so resigned to failure, to disappointment and frustration that I scarcely even stopped to consider what had gone wrong. Human error again, almost certainly. Without pausing, I tugged them off and, head reeling from the effort, put them on again, only to find that I'd put them on inside out. In other, less trying circumstances, this might have seemed fairly poor show for a 42-year-old intellectual. But as things stood, I was happy to regard it as a qualified success, especially as someone was now banging on the door, claiming I'd been in there for ages, wanting to know what the problem was. Good question, I called back, in high spirits again, stuffing my wet trousers into the bag. All things considered, it would have been a high-risk venture. Who knows what new permutations of disarray might have resulted to have attempted to get my new trousers off and on. They might have been inside out, but they were on. They were on. That was the important thing. Back in the cafe, surrounded by a sea of chairs, Dazed and Amsterdam Dave were unconcerned by the state of my trousers. Already, just seconds later, it seemed hard to believe that I could have run up such an enormous bill of difficulties back there in the changing room. Wow, it was another world, that toilet. Practically a different universe, one with its own extraordinary set of problems and obstacles. A piece of sophisticated electronic music came and went on the sound system, subsiding in a long ambient wash that made a peaceful resolution of human difficulties seem a distinct, almost inevitable possibility. What with one thing and another, we were all a bit bedraggled, but the cafe was quite a cosy place to marshal our resources or whatever. Quite suddenly, though, Amsterdam Dave said, "By the way, did you know your trousers are inside out?" "No, they're not," I said. "Yes, they are," said Dazed. "Well, that's where you're both wrong," I said. The interlude of sitting quietly in the cafe had enabled me to see my earlier difficulties in the toilet in an entirely new light, and to hold my own in any debate, however fiercely contested. It might look to you, to outsiders, as it were, as if my trousers are inside out, I said, but they are fine. The truth is that I have turned inside out. That's quite a controversial analysis, said Amsterdam Dave. Controversial, but from my point of view, entirely correct. And now, if you don't mind, I would like to discuss something else. Like what? Like what we do next. You see, I was all for moving on somewhere else. The two others were quite content, but I was all for moving on somewhere else, somewhere new and possibly better. I was restless, and who knows the part played in this restlessness by the fact that my trousers were, however strenuously I may have denied it, inside out. Was that why I was so anxious to shift us from inside the cafe to outside on the street before returning inside once more? All things considered, this was an excellent place, but I kept wanting to move on, kept wanting to go somewhere else. What I want, I said, is a place where we can sit down, where we can just chat for a couple of hours before we go to Matt and Alexandra's lavish suite. A place with nice music, comfortable seats and nice tea and so forth. I went on and on about this, and as I did so I had a dim sense that I was working through something, some neurosis that refused to manifest itself plainly, and then it came to me. Do you know, I said, I've just described exactly the place we're in. I'm already in the place I want to go to. Oh, well done, darling, said Dazed. You've escaped from samsara. And so I had. I'd unblocked all sorts of cafe chakras and was experiencing a sense of absolute calm. I was happy to be here in this chair-intensive cafe in the autumn of my drug-taking years with my soon-to-be ex-girlfriend Dazed, who a few weeks later would succumb to one of her periodic bouts of severe depression, and my old friend Amsterdam Dave, whom I'd only met the night before, and who, months later, would himself, like the author of the present memoir, go completely to pieces. I think I'm going to leave that particular, I mean, it's obviously an incredible cliffhanging moment, but and just to reassure those of you who don't know my stuff that it's not all just this kind of neurotic head-banging stuff, I'll read a bit from my serious academic study of D.H. Lawrence. This has got a nice quote from John Berger on the back. The kind of book that gives literary criticism a bad name, he said, which he intended as a compliment, of course. This is at the beginning of this book. I mean, Lawrence was really preoccupied by where the best place, where was the best place to live in order to write his book. So I was in similar kind of uncertainty when it came to writing my book about Lawrence, and with my then girlfriend Laura, we were in Rome. I'd gone to Rome to write my book about Lawrence, and then we got an offer from our friends called Hervé and Mimi to go and stay with them in a Greek island called Alonissos. And so we decided to do that. From my point of view, 6 weeks on a Greek island, relatively speaking a cool Greek island, seemed a lovely prospect, the perfect time and the perfect place to begin my book on D.H. Lawrence. That's what I'll do, I said to myself. I'll start my study of D.H. Lawrence in Alonissos. It was the perfect place. I had everything I needed except my edition of the complete poems, which I'd left with a friend in Paris. Not that it mattered. Just before the British Council Library in Rome had closed for the summer, I'd taken out several volumes of the Cambridge edition of Lawrence's letters, and they'd keep me going for a good while. I had a biography to check dates, copies of a few of the novels. It was perfect. According to Hervé, Lara and I would have a room to ourselves where in the mornings I could begin writing my study of D.H. Lawrence. It was perfect. It would have been helpful to have had my edition of the complete poems with me, but it was not indispensable to my beginning the study. The important thing was that I had this chunk of uninterrupted time with no distractions. I should have taken out volume 4 of the Cambridge edition of Lawrence's letters from the British Council Library, but volumes 2 and 3, which I did get out, were certainly enough to be going on with. I was more concerned about not having my edition of the complete poems, which, for my purposes, was probably the single most important book of Lawrence's, without which I would be able to make only very limited progress on my study of Lawrence. Such limited progress, in fact, that it would be scarcely worth starting. My copy of the complete poems was crammed with notes and annotations, and without it I was probably better off relaxing on Alonissos, gathering my strength and marshalling my ideas on Lawrence rather than actually trying to write anything. Suddenly, that book of poems, which until 2 weeks previously had been by my side constantly for 2 months, and which I hadn't even opened in that time, hence the decision to leave it in a box at a friend's house in Paris, seemed indispensable to any progress. Fortunately, though, a friend of that friend was flying from Paris to Rome, and he agreed to pick up my copy. We met at the San Callisto. I bought him a coffee, and he handed over the book, simple as that. It was not just a good feeling being reunited with my copy of the complete poems on the night before we were flying to Alonissos. It was an omen, a clear sign that I was meant to start my study of Lawrence that summer. After retrieving the complete poems, Lara and I headed home to pack. With all the books by and about Lawrence, my luggage was incredibly heavy. Not just inconveniently so, but excess baggagely so. I took out a few books that I didn't need, which I'd only packed because they were thin. Mornings in Mexico, Apocalypse, things like that. But these were so light as to make no difference, and I put them back in the bag I'd just taken them out of. I looked at the copy of the complete poems and felt suddenly sure that if I took it to Alonissos, it would lie unopened for 6 weeks, just as it had lain unopened in Paris for 2 months. But if I didn't take it to Alonissos, I was equally sure that once I was there in Alonissos, I would decide that it was indispensable, and that without it, I would be unable even to start my book on Lawrence. If I take it, I won't need it. If I don't take it, I'll not be able to get by without it, I said to myself, as I packed and unpacked my bag, putting in my copy of the complete poems and taking it out again. After a while, I decided to leave the complete poems and pack the Penguin edition of the selected poems, but that was a ludicrous compromise, since the defining characteristic of the selected poems was that it contained none of the poems I needed. It was a straight choice, either the immense bulk of the complete poems or nothing, and once I recognized that the real issue had nothing to do with whether or not I would need to refer to the complete poems, a very simple one. The value of the complete poems was talismanic. If I had it with me, I would be able to begin my book. If I didn't have it with me, then even if I did not need to refer to it, I would keep thinking that I did and would be unable to begin my book about Lawrence. Put like that, the complete poems was an essential part of my luggage. I had no choice but to bring it with me. Whether I referred to it or not was entirely irrelevant. With that, I put the complete poems on the top of the pile of essential books by and about Lawrence, pulled my rucksack's cord sphincter as tight as possible, and propped it by the door, ready for our departure first thing in the morning. In the morning, before setting off, I took out my copy of the complete poems and left for Greece without it. A good decision, as it turned out. I didn't need the complete poems because once we were installed on Alonissos, I had no impulse to begin my study of D.H. Lawrence anyway. It was not the availability or non-availability of books that was the problem, it was Alonissos itself. We always have this ideal image of being on an island, but actually being on an island always turns out to be hellish. For what it's worth, Lawrence wasn't too keen on islands either. I don't care for islands, especially very small ones, he decided on Ile de Port-Cros. A week later, as if first time around he'd simply been trying out an opinion and had now made up his mind, he announced definitively, "I don't like little islands." Me neither. All you can think of when you're on a small island is the impossibility of leaving when you want to, either because the island you're on is too big and you want to go to a smaller one, or because the island is too small and you want to go to a bigger one. When we arrived at Alonissos on the Flying Dolphin, the island seemed so beautiful that 6 weeks did not seem long enough to enjoy it to the full. Hervé's house had a lovely large terrace with a perfect view of sea and sky, the kind of view you see in posters advertising holidays on idyllic Greek islands. "Oh, this is paradise," I said to Laura, sitting on the terrace, surrounded by sea and sky. "I wish we were going to be here for 6 months." Then, after a week, even a fortnight seemed intolerable. Except for looking at the brochure blue, sea and sky, which after the first couple of days we scarcely even noticed, there was nothing to do, and for that reason it was impossible to get any work done. The best circumstances for writing, I realized within days of arriving on Alonissos, were those in which the world was constantly knocking at your door. In such circumstances, the work you were engaged in generated a kind of pressure, a force to keep the world at bay. Whereas here, on Alonissos, there was nothing to keep at bay. There was no incentive to generate any pressure within the work, and so the surrounding emptiness invaded and dissipated, overwhelmed you with inertia. All you could do was look at the sea and the sky, and after a couple of days you could scarcely be bothered to do that. There was no use blaming my inability to get started on having left my copy of the complete poems in Rome, because I had it beside me here in Alonissos. Yes, at the last moment, with the taxi rumbling downstairs, I dashed back up, retrieved my copy, and lugged it all the way to Alonissos, where, exactly as predicted, it lay unopened by our bed. Everything lay unopened in Alonissos, even the cover of my tennis racket. It was impossible to write on Alonissos, it was impossible to read, and it was impossible to play tennis. It was actually impossible to do anything. I thought that after working on my book about Lawrence in the mornings, I'd spend the afternoons playing tennis, but there were no courts, and so, having spent the mornings not writing my book about Lawrence, I spent the afternoons not playing tennis. The last time I'd been on a Greek island, there were regular, ill-tempered matches between the tourists and the locals. Here there was no football and no tennis. In fact, there was no anything. All you could do was eat lunch and jump into the jellyfish-infested sea from the snake-infested rocks of the Plaka. We saw a snake there on our third day. Lara and I were walking through the little wood before you get to the rocks, and we saw it at the same time. All my life, I've dreaded seeing a snake, and on Alonissos I saw one. We both saw it at the same time, turned on our heels and fled. Now Lawrence, in his white pyjamas, had a rendezvous with his snake, but we fled from ours. I wasn't even sure what happened. Either we saw it lying motionless, and then, as a result of our panic, it suddenly sidled away, or it heard us and began darting away, and as a result of this movement, we saw it. It all happened too fast. It saw us and fled. We saw it and fled. We hoped we never saw it again, and it probably felt the same about us. Not exactly sentiments to make a poem out of. After that, we were nervous about being on the rocks of the Plaka, because although we saw the snake in the woods, it was actually on the sun-warmed rocks of the Plaka that the snakes, like us before we saw the snake, liked to bask, like sharks. We were nervous about the sea anyway because of the jellyfish, and now we were nervous about the rocks because of the snakes. We were also nervous in bed. We were basically just nervous the whole time. We lay there and heard slithery rustling noises, suggesting that things were slithering and rustling outside our door. We lay awake, talking about what things they might be. "I hate slithery things," I said. "I hate rustling things," said Lara. Some things rustle and slither, I said. It was an idiotic conversation, and on one level I couldn't believe we were actually having it. But on another level, I still couldn't believe we were having it. But eventually it wearied us to the point where we could sleep. And basically that's page 22, and there's, for those of you interested, there's another 200 pages of that kind of moaning, but we'll leave it there.